it's my pleasure to introduce the next segment of the program. And what we titled it, although I'm sure perhaps something else will come out at the end and as we go into the next chapter of this wonderful conversation, but the traditional and perhaps forgotten techniques providing an edge to contemporary jewelry. And the participants are Alice Cicolini, who is a wonderful jewelry designer, and Emily Satloff, who is the founder, designer, and curator of Larkspur and Hawk. And the moderator is this old thing. So may I ask Alice and Emily to come forward. So before we jump into the questions, I just want to say that I have great admiration for each of these women. And so for me, I had seen Emily speak at the Museum of Arts and Design, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is so interesting. This is someone that we really want to have with us. And happily we do. And similarly, Alice, whom I've had the pleasure of knowing for some time, it seemed to me that this would make an absolutely wonderful pairing. And so we were able to make it happen. And what we have on the screen is a selection, it's a selection of images that are on a timer. And it's a combination of Alice and Emily, so this being Alice's work. And so that will simply go through, and I am going to ask some questions here. The first one that I'd love to ask is, so Emily, you did not launch Larkspur and Hawk initially as a brand that was, if you will, producing. It was an antique business, more put bluntly. Mm-hmm. And then in about 2008, you decided to sort of start designing. And I'm wondering, what propelled you to do that? And, what and why jewelry?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to be here today. It's a pleasure to sit next to this beautiful, colorful lady and to talk about things that are so passionate to me. And that is a great question. My background was in the history of decorative arts and material culture. It wasn't in jewelry specifically. I loved the history of objects. I actually was initially educated mostly in early American decorative arts and at a graduate level. And I worked at the New York Historical Society in decorative arts. And when my youngest son was about 2 years old, I stopped working and missed being around the objects and the research. And that kind of coincided with a time that I started to collect antique jewelry for myself, pieces that were sort of esoteric, things that I could afford. You didn't need to have a major birthday to purchase. And for me, the research into, a Georgian paste riviere applied the same steps as the research into maybe an early American, highboy. I loved the research. I loved that it was small. I loved that, each thing had a reason for being. And that's really what drove me to jewelry, that it was sort of portable, it was affordable, and it came with history. And that's when Lurksford and Hawk was born, as an antique jewelry business. And I eventually found my way to design in 2008 after teaching clients about the beauty of historic techniques and pieces. And I think I've always been kind of a closeted, creator. I wasn't trained at all as a bench jeweler. I don't have those skills, but color has always called to me, and process has called to me, and I loved certain techniques that were specific to the 18th century, like foiling, and eventually I was encouraged to not feel like I was turning my back on the past by recreating something new. That was a big hurdle for me, because I was pretty much a purist up until that point. And then I realized that I just had this burning desire to experiment with foils. And I realized that I was really not turning my back on the past. I was reviving something with my methodology that was virtually unused today. And so I do see myself very much as a conduit to the past.
We're going to come back to that a little bit later. Alice, so you had quite an interesting path to embarking on jewelry design, and I wonder if you could share that, because it certainly permeates your work. So,
I mean, I see that my career is very much the career of someone who tells stories. So I started out working in the theatre as a director, and then a costume designer. And from there, I went to work for a product designer called Tom Dixon for several years. I pretended to run his business as a 24-year-old. But also worked with him at Habitat, where the grounding was very much, my role was to do the research into the incredible product that Habitat had created in the past, and to figure out how we could kind of restore it into a contemporary relevance. And from there, I went to work for the British Council for almost a decade, where I spent the first half of it as their global fashion curator, and the second half of it as the Director of Arts and Culture for the British Council in India. One of the main kind of imports, I suppose, of my role was really to look at the relevance of craft, and how the important role that craft played in the communication of contemporary British culture, craft and design. I wrote a book for Thames and Hudson, which was called The 21st Century Dandy, and the whole kind of thesis of that was really the sense that the past is kind of, as Walter Benjamin describes it, a labyrinth. So it collapses in on itself. So something that is from the previous century might have a deep relevance to how we live our lives in the contemporary. And so these were a set of concerns that were very much at the core of my master's that I did at Central St Martin's, and the stories that I started to tell about the incredible tradition of enamel.
So, but I just wanted to come back to one thing, which is that India remains an important strand for you throughout. I would say you're the authority, it's your work and life, but that seems to have remained fairly important and constant throughout. Emily, so the Georgian era, what is it about the design vocabulary and the cultural atmosphere of the 18th century that speaks to you so strongly, and how is it that you see it as relevant, forgive the locution, to the contemporary woman?
So the Georgian period, I think, has always called to me because it has certain attributes that mean something to me, and allow me to sort of dive deeper. I love how playful and romantic and filled with meaning it can be. What you look at first sight isn't necessarily everything that piece of jewelry has to tell you. The more you look, the more you find, and I love that very much. Absolutely, I love the techniques. And I love that there's a reason for each technique, and that's, again, tying back to history. So, I work a lot with the foiling technique, but there was a reason that foils existed, and that technique was needed in the 18th century to give stones more color and light and vibrancy in candlelight before we had better lapidary skills. If it's canotile work, that was to use less gold in a time when gold was especially dear. If it's cut steel, it was to mimic the look of rose-cut diamonds in candlelight. Like, each thing has a reason, and I love that. I think that I love the feeling of antique jewelry. I don't mean to get woo-woo, but you kind of feel the hands of the maker in each piece as you touch it. And you also feel what a woman, if it's a female jewel, you feel what she would have felt while she wore that jewel. And there's something that transports you that modern jewelry can do too, but in a different kind of way. Your imagination sort of weaves a story as you wear these pieces. You try to imagine who that woman was and who that maker was. Absolutely love the nostalgia. Each piece comes with a story, a sentimental story. And I love that, I like to say that it's perfectly imperfect. It doesn't look mass-produced, it's handmade, and trends existed, and you see similar things in a category, but each thing is going to look slightly different. And I love that. And I love that it's not overtly obvious what you're wearing. Like, an educated person in 18th century jewelry would know what you were wearing, but it's not always clear. It's not a maker. It's not signed. It's not, it might be marked, but it's not like you're wearing something instantly recognizable. It becomes part of you because it's what you chose, and people may not know how old it is when you're wearing it, or whether it was really expensive or a flea market find, and it doesn't matter. It's, to me, that's what makes it so special. And then the cleverness of the silhouettes that existed 200 years ago that still endure today. I'm personally obsessed with a Riviere, and I love how fashionable women wore them 200 years ago, and fashionable women wear them today, but they might wear them differently. Same with the Gerondole earring, and other silhouettes that really draw us in. So that's sort of a long answer to that question, but those are, in a nutshell, those are the things that I like the best.
So Alice, when I think about your work, and we're going to come back to India for just a moment, and obviously I am caught up in a particular time and part of your work, but I think a lot about India and enamel. And what I wonder is if you could kind of recast what drew you to enamel and what's the constant, because you've done a lot of different things with the medium.
I think because I came to jewelry later in life, I don't make, although I have a huge appreciation for craft, which we'll talk about in a while. But I do draw and I paint. And the moment where I realized that I had found my home in India was when I was sitting in the workshop of Kamal Asad Minakar, who was my collaborator for over a decade, was when we'd spent about a month together just chatting and looking at things and having conversations, and he was telling me about his work and I was telling him about mine, and he went, well, you know what, we are kind of the same. You paint on paper, I paint on gold. And that really kind of opened up our process to each other. And for me, the beauty of enamel was a way of bringing color into jewelry that wasn't about the gemstone. It was about the craft. And I have a huge commitment and purpose, I think, towards reminding people why the handmade is so important. But I think enamel also tells a story about a globalized culture that has existed for thousands of years. The first documented piece of enamel is from 350 BC in Ireland, but yet it also has such a huge kind of import in Persian culture. It's a very significant part of India's jewelry language. Cloisonné is a huge part of Japan's jewelry language. So it reminds us that actually these crafts, these impulses, aren't just about the transmission through trade. They are a kind of essential part of our DNA as human beings, and I think it's really important to remember things like that. But yeah, I mean, enamel, at the time in India when I went there, there was very much in design schools, people were designing, the equivalence of a sort of Tiffany engagement ring with a sort of solitaire in the middle. And I sort of thought, well, how desperately tragic is that when the heritage that you have here is so enormous? What can I do with slightly different eyes to represent it in a contemporary context? So I took that story of the kind of inherent shared beauty of craftsmanship, and I made it really about the way that color and form and pattern only incrementally change as you travel across vast landscapes. So the way that a bird is treated on a northern Chinese silk screen is not enormously different from the way a bird is treated in a piece of enamel work. And if you give a craftsman a series of inspirations and drawings, but in a language they understand, then they will give you their best work. If you give them something that they don't understand at all, then it will be haphazard at best. So there's a kind of fantastic story that I always tell about friends who work in Jaipur with blue pottery, about this word that the craftsmen have, which is the jinjaja. They've got no idea what it is, and I don't know if there are other English people in the room who always used to get sort of crystallized ginger for Christmas in a blue pottery vase. That's what it was that they were making. But nobody in India gets crystallized ginger in a blue pottery vase, so they don't know what it is. And so the quality of that product was not great. Whereas the quality of the sort of enamel work, if you give them something that they understand, they will render something that is non-traditional for them, but in a way that is really at the very kind of like fullest expression of their talent.
So, we're talking a lot about process, which I think is incredible because both of you kind of manifest culture through process. And so prior to the emergence of Larkspur and Hawk, foil backing was perhaps not as well known or understood. And it's quite specific, and it requires a different relationship to color than standard gemstone settings. And what drew you to that, and what does it allow you, or what does it allow the jewel to express that, for example, a modern contemporary stone set piece would not? So even if it's you having a foil-backed piece in a contemporary idiom, it's expressing something to you that is different. And I wonder if you could share that.
So I fell in love with foiling, with antique pieces, and I was mesmerized by the play of color and light. Just to, you probably might know, you might not know, but foiling is the art of placing metallic foils on a closed back setting, so before a stone is set. And it was used in the 18th century because stone cutting wasn't as advanced as it'll later get in the 19th century. It gave stones more color and light and vibrancy and more bounce and sparkle during candlelit evenings. There's this layering that creates this play of color and light as you move. And the foils were either thin sheets of silver or gold or brightly pigmented silver in ways that I promise I don't know how they did it. I own pieces that are 200 years old that are so bright that you would think they were made today, and either they haven't faded or they were even brighter then. People were not afraid of color, and foil wasn't used strictly to imitate stones. It was really its own art form. Paste stones got foiled, diamonds got foiled, everything got foiled. But for me, it was a preservation of I love that play of light and color, and I just had this burning desire after teaching people about its beauty, to make a few of my own designs. I didn't think it was going to go any further than that, and I played with gemstones and candy wrappers, and I had seen enough unset antiques that, you know, here and there, that there isn't one way to foil, but I had an idea of how to do it, and I put a couple of designs into motion, and inadvertently, that was the beginning of a career shift for me. I kind of pivoted from selling antiques to selling antique-inspired pieces, but it is, I like that it's a tactile thing for me. I am not a bench jeweler, but my hand is in it, in the sense that I source foils from weird places. I spend hours playing with the effects of a colored translucent stone over a foil to get the effect that I want. So I love that process. I do think I've resurrected a lost art form in a way that I feel a responsibility to. So education's really important to me. I never expect somebody to understand foiling the way I do. I do know it requires a responsibility to teach and to educate and to explain the why, and, you know, why I do it, why it no longer, you know, is popular. And a lot has to do with changing the way people think about modern jewelry and mass-produced jewelry. We're so conditioned in this sort of gold and diamond and stone market to think of like the 4 C's, and, you know, you have to kind of abandon that when you look at my foil jewelry, because we're not selling fancy diamonds in an open back setting. I'm selling a lot of semi-precious stones with unconventional materials.
That was the next question, actually, I wanted to ask you, which is, you spoke about foiling being used for diamonds, for crystal. What stones do you use in your practice?
So just while this is up, that is an 18th century ribbon necklace that I own. It's all paste with opaline glass, and it has a pink foil under it. But that opaline color, I'm just using that as an example, calls to me so strongly that I spent a long time trying to figure out how I can pay homage to that color in my designs. And so that's an example of something. I've used lavender moon quartz over brightly colored foils to get that sort of luminescence. I use a lot of colorless quartz. It has to be translucent to see a foil. I use also purple quartz, lemon quartz, citrines. I do use more precious stones. I have actually foiled diamonds. And I use precious stones sometimes as accents. But color is a driving force for me. And I'm definitely not afraid of color.
Alice, you are not afraid of color either. And, you know, we so enjoy the pages of sketches for the Indian enamels, for example. But you, too, were fascinated by a particular process, and I wanted to ask you about that. What is backcasting, and what is the framework for that, and how does that influence you?
So, I mean, the concept of backcasting was something that I came up with when I was doing my master's in fashion history. And really what I was trying to say is that, you know, we're always looking forward. We're looking for the thing, the innovation, the forward, the future. And actually we ignore the past at our peril, because the past is something that always returns, but in a different format. And, you know, a very celebrated design curator once said to me, oh, you know, fashion is such a moribund category in design, you know, because you're always looking backwards. But I sort of think about a designer like John Galliano, for example, when he was at Dior. And, you know, John used to specifically use forms that he found in the past to make comment on what was happening in the present. And I think that was quite an important concept in my work as a curator for a long time, because I was looking at archetypes. And then when I came to think about design, I think what I really find so enduringly captivating about jewelry is that it is both about, it's a kind of portal, isn't it, to your present. You're making decisions in the present that are private and meaningful to you, but it's also a portal to culture and to the past, and to a past that is ancient, thousands and thousands of years old. But in a way, it also has something to say to the future, because you're making transformative decisions about perhaps the wife you're about to become, or the adult you're about to become, or the graduate that you are. So I think it starts to kind of have a meaning for me in the jewelry context as well. Enamel at the time, as I was saying, when I started working with it in India, perhaps was not particularly prevalent in jewelry in that moment. But I like to think that one of the things that I was trying to do was to remind people of its great beauty. My hope was not just to make nice work in enamel myself, but also to get other jewelers and craftsmen and producers to start to look at it as a material again in their work. And I sort of feel that amongst other people who started working with enamel around the same time, we've really achieved that. We're at a point in the jewelry market where most major houses now have some elements of enamel in their collection, and that's a huge benefit to the craft, I think.
I'm going to go back to something. If you could just give us a very simple definition of backcasting, what would that be?
The simple definition of backcasting is to look to the past to reflect on the present and the future.
So there's a kind of a parallel process here, even though it manifests quite differently. And so I wonder then, since both of you were engaged, if you will, in finding things in the past to bring forward, what, Emily, for example, has been most challenging in terms of developing a clientele and educating a clientele to find the charm and beauty of this 18th century tradition, when previously perhaps they had no experience of it? And what about bridging that gap?
I think it's incumbent on me to educate. When you work in something as nuanced as foiling, it requires explanation, it requires storytelling. You want to, as I sort of mentioned earlier, you want to dispel sort of modern mass-produced techniques as being the only way to do something. There are other ways, and I think that people don't understand foiling. They don't always understand that something that looks like this is in costume and it's fine jewelry and it's handmade. But also, I work with closed back settings, so there's metal behind the setting, and there's sort of, even if people don't articulate it to me directly, there's that feeling where you get the feeling that people think I'm trying to hide something. Like you're putting, I can't look at the stone from behind. You're covering something. And that's education. I have to teach that, and I give examples, and I show examples of antiques, and there's, a history behind why I do what I do. And so it's fun to share, to sort of spread the word. And again, I do feel like a conduit to the past. I really feel like I'm here, that I was educated in a way that led me here, and that my background in antiques and the history of decorative arts has empowered me to share my knowledge and to spread techniques that are virtually unused in modern jewelry. And then finally, I think it's always a responsibility to explain the care that's needed in a foiled piece of jewelry or an antique piece of jewelry, and that it shouldn't scare you, but it's not the jewelry that you go swimming with. It's not the jewelry that you take a shower with or wash your hands with soap. There's a protocol to letting it age naturally, and that can be a little off-putting for some, but when you're a believer and you really want to either own a piece from the past or own a piece that I've newly created, I think people find that it's worth taking that little extra step to care for it.
What do you find when you talk to clients or prospective clients, be they individual or institutional, if you will, what do you find is the biggest leap for them in, kind of jumping to the other side of the river with a closed back setting? And
I think that a lot of people are drawn to my work because there's a nostalgia to it, and they either recognize what I'm doing and love that I'm recreating something that they don't see in modern jewelry, and I think they're drawn to the color and the technique that allows. Foiling isn't better than open back setting, it's just different, and it's an art form that allows me to almost paint color behind a stone, and so I think that they're, either the storytelling or the technique and the way, frankly, it looks is the thing that draws them in.
That draws them in, but what I'm wondering about is a kind of difficult question, which is, what is the hurdle to overcome? Because they are delightful. They're lovely colors. They shimmer, even in this sort of manufactured light, etc.
Honestly, I think a hurdle is, I mentioned it, but is convincing somebody that it's handmade and fine jewelry, and that because it's brightly colored doesn't mean it's costume jewelry. That's a hurdle that I encounter. A personal hurdle is a responsibility to not, I'm looking to be inspired by the past but not replicate it, and that's a hurdle, to make sure that people understand that I'm not just copying what came from the past, and that it's my modern take on the past, and that they're not wearing reproduction.
So Alice, you have this concept of 3 C's: color, craftsmanship, and collaboration. And I wonder if you could expand on that, because it seems to me that's kind of an undergirding notion that's sort of parallel to some of what Emily's been talking about with respect to the 18th century, to light, to foiling and fabric, which I know you use as well.
Mm. I think I sort of came to that over 17 years of working. The industry, obviously, as Emily was sort of saying, is can be a little bit focused on the 4 C's, and it's this very particular idea of quality that I have always been interested in challenging through my work. So one of the collections that I made was called Landscape, and instead of putting the enamel behind as a supporting cast for the stone, I turned it around to put the enamel as the stone, as the glory, and carved stone just to hold it. And what I was really kind of asking us to have a conversation about is what we really value. Gemstones are extraordinary. What nature has achieved is extraordinary, but it is also the crafts that turn them into things that are things we want to wear and cherish and pass down. So the 3 C's are, color, craft, and collaboration. Color, because, like Emily, it's something that I find, enduringly fascinating. Craft, because I think that it's a sort of existential wisdom. It's not just something that we do, it's a cultural heritage that we have to consider how to preserve. And it was an amazing panel that we listened to earlier about the preservation of skill. Sustainability of skill is something that I've tried really hard to talk to journalists about over the years when we have conversations about, the sustainability of the material, that you can't have that conversation without talking about the craft at the same time. And I think the thing that I brought to my practice really as a curator is the idea of collaborating with an artisan. On my website, I profile all of the artists that I've worked with. That's really important to my practice. I talk about them in all of the interviews that I do, because I want them to grow their businesses too. It's not just about me, it's about them getting more and more customers. I want other designers, I want other businesses to go into these craftsmen and give them work also. But collaboration is not about, the ginger jar kind of reference, the sort of showing up, throwing a drawing at a craftsman and walking away again, expecting what comes out the other end to be what was in your mind. The collaboration is about a long-term engagement. So I spent a year sitting with Kamalji in Jaipur, exchanging ideas, sketches, notes, samples. Most designers going into India will spend a week at best. And so what they get in return is the quality of something that they've spent a week paying attention to. The collaborative practice is a really serious part of working with craftsmen that I think a lot of people in the industry need to kind of consider more deeply. They are artists, not producers.
So here's a question for you. You have worked extensively with Kamal, whom I actually went and tracked down when Sibjo met in Jaipur. And do we have any responsibility in situations like Kamal's where practice a particular form of enamel called meenakari, and although he has 2 daughters, it is possible that this practice ends with him. And I wonder if you could, obviously what we're talking about, or one of the things we've been talking about, is the criticality of preservation of craft, heritage, and technique. So what do you think happens when something like what I'll call the Kamal factor emerges? And what is our responsibility, if any?
It's a great question, and during my life in India, I had that conversation with many people who work in all sorts of different crafts. And one of the things that I learned from some of the craft impresarios working in the country was that as I think somebody else has said over the course of this conference, it only takes 2 generations for a craft to die in a family. The father doesn't teach his son, therefore the son doesn't teach the grandson, and neither does the grandfather. And at that point, it's gone in that family. Now, if that happens across a whole city, then that's a sort of almost like a war of attrition. And one of the things that you were talking about earlier on the panel, really about encouraging more people to come into bench work, for example, is in a country like India, is to demonstrate to those children that there's an economic benefit in doing so. 80% of the British Crafts Council did a report in the UK on craft more broadly, and they discovered that 80% of people who work in craft earn less than £20,000 a year, and that's $26,000. You can't survive on that. And if you're a young man working in Jaipur, you'll go and drive an Uber, because you're going to earn more money than that in that kind of profession. The problem, obviously, that Kamal has quite specifically is that he had girls rather than sons. And, he doesn't not teach them because they're women. He doesn't teach them because they'll take that craft knowledge and his family kind of sacred information into their husband's family. That's why it's like a kind of a protectionism, if you like. Although I am delighted to report that he is actually teaching his daughters, and I think that's partly because of the conversations that we've had over the years, where I've kind of said, really, do you really want to see this craft exit from your family? Don't you think you have a responsibility to see it continue? The other part of what he's doing, which I am increasingly excited by, and I was thinking about this when Linus was talking earlier, the global nature of craft. He is actually teaching a young French woman who has come to sit with him because she's taking it seriously. She's already been there for a year. She's intending to stay for another 2 years, and because he can see that actually she's committed to really genuinely pursuing her skill in his craft practice, he's sharing it with her. And that's not it's not a unique story. I've heard it in other disciplines. There's some artists from the UK who've similarly spent many years in India learning to do traditional art practice, where the master has given their tools to them rather than somebody in their family who was coming up in the tradition as well, which is a huge compliment, by the way, to pass on your tools. So it's not necessarily the end of Kamal's lineage, but the only way that you get people to stay in a tradition is to demonstrate that there's a livelihood and a respect attached to it. And so one of the conversations I frequently have with people, and I'm sure lots of independent designers suffer from this as well, is people sort of say, well, why is your work so expensive? You know, they're quite comfortable to pay high prices for work that comes from the Maison in France because they somehow understand that they're stepping up into a Cartier price point. But they don't want to necessarily pay for artisan work from a craftsman in Jaipur, despite the fact that he's continuing the heritage of his family, which is over 250 years old, you know, in pieces that have been owned by the Maharajas of Rajasthan that feature in the V&A's collections. They don't, and so I see part of my responsibility as being like Emily to continue to try and communicate that actually what you're buying into is a kind of existential wisdom, you know, is a river of making, a kind of practice heritage that is a critical part of who we are as a human race.
Emily, do you find, a couple of questions. First of all, how did you, if you will, I know how you found foiled pieces of jewelry, but how did you go about learning to understand the actual craft of it so that you could, in a sense, have a sense of connoisseurship, both not only for what you were buying, but for what it is that you would be designing?
So for what I collected as antique foil jewelry, that takes a lot of, really honestly, a lot of looking, a lot of touching, a lot of talking to people. Feel is so important to an antique. You sort of hone in on sort of attributes that 200 years will give a piece of jewelry. It can be leathery feeling. It can, you know, not be too grabby. All of those things, but you can read in books, and that's important. But it's really the actual looking, touching, and talking to people that gives you the education with foil jewelry and Georgian jewelry, and quite honestly, making some mistakes along the way. In terms of how did I learn to do the modern, they were hand in hand. You know, as I said, you know, occasionally I had a repair to do on an 18th century, you know, foil drop, and you know, respectfully, I got to get to witness, you know, a foil that was, you know, either lost its color or, you know, it just needed to be replaced, and, you know, carefully you take it apart. You know, I work with a jeweler to take it apart, and you witness, like, what went into those layers. And so, you know, and as I said, there isn't a textbook example of, like, here are the directions to how you foil, but I know how I do, and I, by the same token, almost every workshop that I've worked with, I've had to teach them what foiling is and how to do it the Larkspur and Hawk way. So there is, you know, it is slow and it does take time. And as a designer, sometimes the vision you have in your head for something doesn't always come to fruition right away. You know, you get your first pass samples back and you can't be more excited. And then you kind of go from this like high to this, oh, you know, it's not exactly the way I wanted it. The foil's wrinkled. You know, it's a learning curve. But, you know, it's one that I'm willing to, you know, to kind of keep at because I believe in it.
Did you deconstruct historical examples?
Not for the purpose of deconstructing. And then I add things, like I add my mark to it, where, you know, I have hand-painted foils. Again, I mentioned 18th century pigments versus now. I think they had access to things that we don't anymore, in terms of things that might be unsafe to use today. I sometimes use textured foils. That's my invention. Sometimes I use matte foil. Sometimes I use shiny foil. And then I also, I'm just always thinking, what can I put beneath a stone? And a number of years ago, I started to collect antique textiles. and sometimes antique ribbons, and they were very intricately embroidered, and I experimented on my own with cutting little bits of them and placing them in the settings instead of foil, and they're so beautiful and so special, and it allows me to get a pattern underneath a stone in a way that I couldn't do with just a single colored foil. And that also allows me to have my hand very much in it. I source the materials, I cut them, I place them into each setting. So that's kind of something that I added along the way. And another thing I added along the way for a collection that is out now is hand-painted vellum that an artist did for me that goes beneath the stone. So sometimes I quite frankly, this is a ribbon piece in the box. Sometimes I make my life harder. If it's hard, if it is already difficult to convince somebody of the value of, modern foil jewelry, it's that much harder to explain the value of a textile underneath a gemstone in a silver setting, or a little piece of a painting. It really, but it's something I creatively love to do, and that's a multicolored textile piece that I adore. Anyway, so those are my contributions to the craft.
So I have a question for each of you, which neither of you, I think, is expecting. But what are you each wearing of your own work? And what drove you to select that for today?
Me?
I love both of you, but I'm not going to dictate order.
Go ahead, Alice.
I mean, I wear the same jewelry all the time, so I didn't select particular pieces to wear for today as distinct from any other day. I don't know why I kind of function like that, but they are pieces that all have huge meaning for me. So my ring on this side has a garnet in it that was cut for me by Jean-Noel Sony from Top Notch Faceting in California, and I think he's an insanely talented contemporary lapidary. And he gave that to me, so that's, and it's chocolate brown, which is one of my favorite colors. And then the jackets that I'm wearing are from my sari collection. I designed a whole collection inspired by the sari, partly because I find, well, the sari and the kimono actually are probably some of the most sustained form of semiotic communication in dress that we still have globally. So a sari can tell, you can tell where in the country somebody comes from, how they wear it will probably tell you what caste they're from, and perhaps what they do for a profession. The length of the sleeve in the kimono will tell you how old the person is who's wearing it. The kind of patterns on it will tell you what time of year it is, or what the occasion is that they're wearing it for. So I find those kinds of I find that really fascinating, because I think we all tell people who we are by the way that we dress, and even somebody who says they're not interested in fashion is actually telling you something when they say that. So it's one of the principal forms of how we communicate. So I wear these jackets because I'm particularly fond of that collection, but also because they wrap around a ring that's very important to me for personal reasons. So yeah, that's me and my jewels.
And what about your ears?
And my ears. So my ears are also from the sari collection. I think they're zircons, which are stones that I find really fascinating. I do, like Emily, I think, perhaps seek out ways to make my life more difficult by using gemstones that people don't really know anything about, or they haven't heard of, and they don't understand why they're so expensive and so on. So, but the zircon is a stone that I particularly love because it comes in myriad colours, and it has a very kind of, it's got a very strong fire and clarity. And the line is the line of colour around the stone. You can actually see it here, which comes from the pitch eye, the miniature. The reason I started using lines of colour around stones is because in the pitch eye, the red line denotes sacred space. And really what I was talking about was the sacred space of the enamel craft. So this is also that line with zircons on the end.
Emily?
Most noticeably, I'm wearing my largest piece in all of my collections. It's a Sadie Riviere, and the Sadie collection is sort of an irreverent collection that mixes stone cuts, bezels and shapes all into one in a not a patterned way. And I chose her partially because of scale, knowing I would be presenting. It was sort of a little bit of something I could reference to you. But it also is sort of this, not really a charm necklace, but a memory for me, because each setting references, and each stone references a different part of my collection that I've done over the years. And quite frankly, blue went with my blue dress, so there was that. And then, as I very much like to do, I'm actually wearing an 18th century pair of silver and diamond Dutch earrings as a reminder of, you know, they're in closed back settings, but a reminder of where it all starts. Mm-hmm. And I love, you know, to reunite something from the past with something that I created.
So my last question for you is, how do you avoid, except that's negatively phrased, but anyway, we'll go with it and give me an exception if that's okay. How do you avoid, if you will, overly, a strict replication of the past, be it in the motifs of an enamel that are used or in the even the syncopation of the stones that are set, so that what you're doing is inspired by, if you will, rather than less innovative and reflective of who you are?
Well, I don't use Jaipuri patterns, would be the first way that I separate myself from the Meenakari tradition. I try to look at the essence of it rather than the kind of representational kind of quality of it. Meenakari in Hindi means secret, and it's called that because the enamel is a conversation that you're having with your jewellery that perhaps only you know about. It's very rarely turned around with the enamel to face the front, although lots of young women in India who have their grandmother's jewels now do that. And that concept of secrecy, or the thing that only you know about, is something that I carry forward in my work in lots of different ways, for example, where I might set stones and things like that. I also work now a lot in London with a craftsman called Stanislav Raymer, who's based in South London, and the work that we do together is much more to do with lacquer enamel, and it's much more geometric than a lot of what you see in the enamel tradition. And what he and I do together, I call him my mad scientist, and he sits in his shed trying to figure out how he can push the particular qualities of the lacquer material that are different from vitreous enamel. Vitreous obviously is extraordinarily beautiful, but it's extremely fragile. It's not an everyday material. If you were going to ask me the question that you asked Emily about challenges, that is one of the main ones. Why would I spend so much money on something that I can only wear as an occasion object? And the lacquer enamel, I suppose, is an answer to that. It's much more durable. You can wear it every day. It has that kind of ability to absorb itself into your daily life. Like I say, I never take my pieces that I'm wearing today off, and that's because I can wear them without concern. But equally, you can do things with lacquer enamel that you can't do with vitreous. Vitreous is a kind of ceramic process. It's heat-fired at very high temperatures. If you put lots of different colours together, they will kind of merge into a blob of brown. Whereas with the lacquer, you can work with it in a way that you can set colour inside colour. I can make marbled patterns that have no boundaries. Taffin uses what's called high ceram, which is a more high percentage porcelain than the one that I use, but you can cast it, you can drill into it, you can make shapes with it. So there's all sorts of ways in which enamel is becoming quite an innovative material, and I think that I'm fascinated by the way in which innovations in the technology and the material process also allow us to keep moving the conversation of enamel forward. So I'm not interested in a past that kind of fixes things in place. It's one of the things that I feel quite strongly is a problem for some kinds of craft, is that craftsmen are just expected to keep making the things that they've always made. Well, that's not really what they should be asked to do. They should be allowed in their own way to kind of keep moving their practice forward. And it's part of my design process that I really enjoy.
And for me, I think it's, again, paying homage to the past, and I focus sort of on the soul of a piece rather than directly replicating it. But there might be something in that piece that calls to me. It could be a setting, it could be a call-it setting. You see a lot of call-it settings being reproduced today in a very literal way. When I started to use a call-it setting a number of years ago, almost when I first started my modern designs, I really didn't want it to look like exactly a Georgian setting, so I made them very exaggerated in a way that wouldn't have been done, but it was almost like the setting became the piece. So I try very hard to always have my spin on it, so it wouldn't be mistaken for something that is so literal. And honestly, I am a modern woman who likes modern dressing, and I'm not going to Bridgerton balls. I'm not in a costume. I dress for today, and I think that I try to either scale things for women today, or I'll take a very trend-driven design, like an ear climber, a number of years ago that you wouldn't have found in the Georgian period, but then I apply my foiling technique to it. And it's this play that is so important to me at Larkspur & Hawk of the idea of then and now and then, and sort of these enduring silhouettes that we inherit, like a chandelier earring, and how I can keep that relevant today, and how you might pair that with very modern dressing. And then also a modern piece, and how a Georgian woman would have, maybe how a Georgian jeweler would have approached a modern silhouette if he were alive today. And most important, and I really genuinely mean this, if my modern designs get mistaken for an antique, then I have failed at my work. That's really, really genuinely not what I want to do. I want Larkspur & Hawk to be known for, Georgian revival, but I don't want I never want to see a piece of Larkspur & Hawk in an antique jewelry dealer's case.
Well, I love the ear climber reference. I think it captures what you are striving for in a perfect way. And now I wonder if any of you have any questions for Annie.
Alice, I love both of your work. But I have a question from a technical vantage point. I have a couple of questions from a technical vantage point. I noticed the vase, and I noticed the bracelet that you made, and the stackable rings. Are those look to me like a lacquer? Are they a vitreous, but are they a lacquer? And can you speak a little bit about your technique in the lacquer?
So in the vitreous tradition that I work with in Jaipur, you cast the form, and then it's mostly in 22 karat yellow gold, and then you hand engrave the pattern into the form. My enamel craftsman Kamal will grind his own pigments from glass because he is very particular about the kind of fineness of pigment that he's working with. You mix it with water, you put it inside the channel that's been created, and then you heat fire it. The kind of scientific skill is to know which colors to fire first. You have to fire them in an order of heat and what can survive. And then you do that several times over, and you polish it with an agate stone, and it's part of what gives it this extraordinary radiance. And mostly he and I have always worked together with transparent color, because part of what I find so beautiful is the extraordinary quality of the line that he's engraving into the channels. It's almost completely perfect, and obviously also what brings light into the pattern. Lacquer enamel is completely different. I mean, it's not very glamorous sounding, but it's a dental resin in effect. But it has porcelain in it, and it also has pigment in it. And so when I first started working with that, I kind of thought, well, how am I going to what's the difference? That's lacquer. So you can't stack vitreous enamel. Well, you can, but it won't last very long. If you did, you can buy a vitreous piece, and if you drop it on the day that you bought it, it will break. especially if it's on a stone floor. So if you buy a lacquer enamel piece and you drop it, it won't break. It will kind of, bounce like all jewelry bounces. So it gave me an opportunity to start stacking and making these kind of totems of colour. I mean, I didn't really go into this before, but Ettore Sotsas was one of my great inspirations when I first started, who was the founder of the Memphis movement, and his great mission in life was to bring colour into people's homes. Why did people have such boring homes full of beige and white and, dark wood and whatever? And so all of his furniture was enormously brightly coloured, it was patterned, and I sort of thought to myself, well, why shouldn't I do that for the body? Wouldn't it be fun to get people to kind of have these totems of colour all over their fingers, ears, and arms? And, the technical treatment of the lacquer is, in effect, it's a CAD cast process, so the channels are created in the CAD. And then, but again, it's hand applied. The difference between the way that we work with it in London and perhaps what you might find in factories in China is that my craftsman will also fire it 3 times. It's centrifugal, he'll polish it back. It's got this kind of quality and finish. It's completely flush to the surface. It's actually quite difficult to get, enamel to sit on a curve like that. So it's technically complex, even though it might look quite simple. And when I've seen attempts at replicating that kind of idea that come out of a factory where part of the production and price point model is to do it quickly, the enamel always dips in the middle. You can feel the metal surface of the channel that's been created, all of those kinds of things. We're not showing them here, but some of the work that I've been doing more recently is in a way to kind of look at how can I bring perhaps those 2 traditions together in a way that's quite interesting. So we're doing a lot of work with what I'm calling decorative guilloche. So we're putting engraved pattern into the surface of the metal. Sometimes we're also making that pattern in a champ levé, so we're putting enamel on that surface layer as well, and then over the top a transparent layer of colour. So you're kind of playing with depth of field and all of those things, but it's essentially that we're making it in the CAD. And then actually one of the beautiful collection that's also not on there, I'm sorry about that, but is we're working with this kind of idea of the chrysanthemum and actually using hand engraving then into the gold lines to kind of raise up and lift up the pattern in a way that's really exciting. And so it's another layer of craft. I mean, I do have collections where there are about 6 people who touch my work. And in a way it's important to say that because I think when 6 people who all come to their practice with 30 years of experience put their energy and their passion and commitment and intention into a piece that you buy, you feel that energy in the work when you put it on. And I just find that sort of deeply inspiring. Clients have sort of said to me that they feel they lift themselves up into my work. And that's not, I don't take any credit for that. The credit goes entirely to the craftsman.
Anybody else? Questions? Okay, then. Well, I want to say thank you very much. Absolutely joyful expedition, as well as very interesting from technical points of view as well. But beautiful, beautiful work. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank everyone.